And you should see there the link on the screen, which is groups.google.com/g.nikanet. And I know that's a little complicated. I'll try to post that in the chat again. And you can post at nikanet@googlegroups.com once you're subscribed. You can also sign up for Nika Notes, which includes a weekly article by an invited author, followed by news updates of the week. You sign up at the Alliance for Global Justice website, afgj.org. Several e-books about Nicaragua are also available at the same website, afgj.org, for free in English and Spanish, and they're downloadable in several formats. The e-books cover topics such as the attempted coup of 2018, events in Nicaragua in 2019, disinformation about Nicaragua, and Nicaragua's indigenous peoples. Slide 2, please. We strongly urge you to contact your Congress member and your senators, telling them that you're opposed to the Realizan Act. This bill would impose punitive and coercive measures on Nicaragua in an attempt to influence the outcome of the elections coming up in November. There's a lot of information at the AFGJ site with an easy script and an email form there. That particular URL is afgj.org/urgent tell Congress no sanctions on Nicaragua. You can also find 2 sign-on letters at afgj.org. These, one is for organizations and one is for individuals, asking the United States government not to interfere with Nicaragua's sovereignty. You can sign those at that website, and I'm also going to post those links, which are even more complicated, in the chat. Please share both of those letters with your organizations and with news outlets and members of Congress. Slide 3, please. If you would like to become more active in opposing the Realizan Act and U.S. interference in Nicaragua, here are 2 things you can do. 1, you can join our lobbying committee. Please put your name and email address in the chat if you're interested, directed to the panelists, and we'll make a note of it. And second, you can watch a 50-minute video of a webinar that we recently conducted about the Realizan Act with useful details about how to lobby against it more effectively. And that URL is bit.ly/Realizan lobbying. Okay, this webinar is part of a series occurring about once a month. Please mark your calendars for August 22nd at the same time as today. Slide 4, please. So the August 22nd webinar is called What's at Stake in Nicaragua's 2021 Elections? The speakers, Sophia Clark and Saul Arana, will address why this is such an important election, why the U.S. has spent so much money and effort to try to keep the Sandinistas from winning, why the new electoral council that oversees the process is the most progressive and diverse group ever seen in a nation. And they will respond to questions about the elections. So to register for that webinar, you would go to bit.ly/NikaOG22. We're inviting organizational co-sponsors for future webinars. If you're interested, please write a note in the Q&A and we will follow up with you. So that's the end of the slides. The format for today's 75-minute webinar is the following. Nan McCurdy will cover some of the important news items related to Nicaragua since our last webinar. And then the other 2 speakers will have a total of 35 minutes for their presentations. That will allow plenty of time at the end for Q&A by the audience. And one last note to the audience, you can put your comments in the chat, but please make sure you put any questions intended for the panelists to answer in the Q&A. I will be pulling those questions to address to the panelists. And now we'll introduce the first speaker. Nan McCurdy is the editor of the online weekly Nika Notes. She's a United Methodist missionary working in development in the countryside of Mexico. She lived in Nicaragua for over 30 years and continues to have deep connections there. Please welcome Nan McCurdy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I wasn't at the last one, so I'm going to share just a few of the advances from the last 2 months in Nicaragua. The plastic-free Solentiname Sustainable Tourism Project received the 2020 Excellence in Tourism Award during the International Tourism Fair of Spain in May. The award evaluates innovative projects in tourism, art, and culture. Solentiname is an archipelago of 36 islands in Nicaragua's Lake Cocibolca. In its May report, the International Monetary Fund states that Nicaragua has worked to maintain social and public investment programs, safeguard job stability, and actively seek public financing, registering a deficit of the non-financial public sector of 2.5% of GDP, the lowest in the region. The report also noted that the fiscal policy measures taken in 2020 increased resources for the public health sector to face the COVID-19 pandemic and prioritize the population affected by the 2 November hurricanes. Regarding the vaccination process, Nicaragua began its program on March 2nd. On June 2nd, Nicaragua and the Central America Bank for Economic Integration signed loans for $118.5 million for vaccines and improvement of hospitals. CABE President Dante Mossi noted that the bank is financing 25 projects due to the good management and excellent relations between the bank and Nicaragua. CABE also approved a loan for $151 million to further clean up Lake Managua. This loan will guarantee full coverage of potable water and sanitation services to more than 1 million inhabitants. A May report from the World Food Program on Nicaragua's emergency response after the November 2020 hurricanes acknowledges the government's response and excellent attention to communities. It also praised the expansion of the school meal program to more than 1.2 million children. US $222 million will be invested in 281 water and sanitation projects in the South Caribbean region over the next 10 years. The first projects will be inaugurated in 2022. The Minister of Education inaugurated the installation of wireless internet at the Jose Santos Zelaya Education Center in Matiguas. In addition, workshops on art, culture, tradition, and creativity development were held throughout the country. Many rural schools now have internet. And in its June 28th report, the ministry showed that the budget for education quadrupled between 2006 and 2020. During this 13-year period, 35,400 schools were built, expanded, or repaired. The number of teachers in the public education system rose by 30%. The illiteracy level dropped to 4.5% in 2020. The president of the Supreme Electoral Council, Brenda Rocha, said that the opening for the inscription of presidential candidates by parties and alliances is July 28th. That's according to the electoral calendar. That is when the CSE begins reviewing whether or not candidates fulfill the requirements according to the laws. 17 parties are participating in this year's elections, including the PLC, Camino Cristiano, ALN, APRE, Alianza Ciudadanos por la Libertad, which is an alliance of 2 parties, and YATMA on the Atlantic coast. Along with the FSLN alliance, United Nicaragua Triumphs, which is made up of 9 parties and 4 movements. The provisional electoral roll currently being verified exceeds 4.3 million registered citizens, 49% men, 51% women. And of more than 4 million registered, 1.6 million are between 16 and 25 years of age. So it's the young people more than any other group who will determine who wins this election. There will be 3,110 voting centers. This is the largest number ever, so that people don't have to go very far to vote. According to the most recent survey, the FSLN has 62.8% of voting strength, with 43% hard vote, 11% soft vote, and 9% tending to vote for this party. The survey was carried out between June 27 and July 3rd to Nicaraguans over 16 years of age. 76% consulted said that conditions in Nicaragua have progressed greatly in relation to 14 years ago. On the imposition of sanctions by the US, 83.7% said that this was another manifestation of the interventionist US behavior in the internal affairs of their country, and 85% said that the sanctions imposed by the US harm democracy and harm the Nicaraguan people. The police report on the Program for Comprehensive Care and Development of Adolescents and Youth from the first semester of 2021 indicates that some 3,700 families participated in workshops and received psychological care on prevention, identification, and treatment for addictions. The report noted that 112,000 youths attended community counseling programs and 11,000 police community meetings for prevention of situations of violence were held. The National Plan for the Fight Against Poverty and for Human Development, 2022-2026, was presented the first week of July by the Finance Minister, Ivana Costa, who said, "It is a plan with heart, focused on the most important aspect of any society, not on how much it impacts the economy, but on how much it changes people for the better, on how much it improves people's living conditions. It is a plan focused on the human being." In remembering the time between 1990 and 2007 with the three neoliberal governments, he reminded people that there are two indicators that showed a terrifying turning point in things getting worse in the country. In 2005, poverty was increasing by nearly 2 points a year, and it made a jump from 45% to 48% that year. We were on a path to 70% poverty. Homicide rates jumped 4.5 points. That is to say, we were on the path of the Northern Triangle. We would have easily reached 60 homicides per 100,000. Acosta mentioned changes since the return of the Sandinista government in 2007, an increase of 99.6% in improved roads and highways, the reduction from 93 to 21 per 100,000 in the rate of maternal and child mortality, and a 91% increase in investment in energy, drinking water, and sanitation. More than 1.7 million students with free education and efficient management of funds received from the international community. The political will is to have good government focused on the fight against poverty, he said. Acosta said that the decision was made to deliver the best public sector hospital infrastructure in Central America, which has had an important impact on the capacity to care for the COVID pandemic and the demand for public health in general. With relation to education, he said that there has been a leap in education public policy since 2007. School meals were guaranteed, 1.2 million meals daily, a policy to finally guarantee enrollment, retention, promotion, and ensure the stability and quality of education. Another great achievement is the investment in energy and quality of service. In addition to this is the construction of 71,000 homes and the capitalization of the rural sector to reduce poverty and ensure food security and sovereignty. A great leap has been made in social and economic transformation. He said probably no country in the world has had 4 consecutive impacts of great size in 3 years. We're talking about the coup attempt and the pandemic, but also the impact from the 2 hurricanes in less than 10 days, an issue that shows the impact of climate change, he said. The hurricanes had an impact of nearly $1 billion, while the virus pandemic had an impact of $2 billion. However, the impact of the coup attempt reached more than $24 billion. The failed coup attempt was the worst pandemic. It has had an impact of 8 to 10 times the pandemic. It shows that those who promoted the coup attempt were backed by imperialist countries that really wanted to destroy the future and the hope of several generations. But in the end, it shows the ability, resilience, dedication, and good public policies of the government of President Daniel Ortega. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nan. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Chuck Kaufman. He has been on the national staff of Nicaragua Network / Alliance for Global Justice since 1987. He gave up his successful advertising business out of disgust at Congress's cowardice during the Iran-Contra scandal. And he went on his first coffee-picking brigade to Nicaragua that same year. He has led many delegations, including one prior to the 2006 presidential election in Nicaragua, in which the U.S. ambassador admitted that he had $17 million to spend on the election. Please welcome Chuck Kaufman.
Thank you, Barbara. My talk today is limited to the U.S. electoral interference since the 1979 triumph of the Sandinista Revolution, whose 42nd anniversary we celebrate tomorrow. So let's start with the first democratic election in Nicaragua's history, that of 1984, organized by the Council of State, which had ruled since the 1979 overthrow of the dictatorship. Although 8 parties or coalitions of parties ran in the 1984 election, when the Sandinista victory began to look inevitable, the Reagan administration forced the leading coalition of right-wing parties to pull out of the race, giving the U.S. the pretext to refuse to recognize the results. Other international observer groups found the elections to be primarily free and fair. So already in 1984, we saw the United States place itself as the final judge and jury as to whether or not an election was legitimate. Legitimacy is not based on the facts or conduct of an election, but solely on U.S. foreign policy objectives. So an election in Venezuela, called by Jimmy Carter the best election ever monitored by the Carter Center, can be delegitimized by the U.S. and the corporate media, whereas a corrupt election like that in Honduras in 2013, where I myself witnessed vote buying and changing vote totals, can be declared free and fair by the State Department stenographers and the corporate media. Delegitimizing elections is one of the primary overt tools used by the United States to subvert democracy around the world. Covert actions are outside my mandate for today. But the 1990 election in Nicaragua is where the U.S. game plan for electoral intervention was written, perfected, and victorious. It is the game plan that has been used overtly to distort elections, not just in Nicaragua, but around the world. Alan Weinstein, a founder and theoretical planner for the NED, in a Washington Post interview in 1991 said, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA." Well, of course, the CIA is still doing it, but anyway, US elites have no respect for democracy at home or abroad, especially abroad. Henry Kissinger lifted the curtain of illusion and told us a snippet of truth prior to the 1973 coup against Salvador Allende in Chile. "I don't see why," Kissinger said, "we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves," end quote. Weinstein was talking about the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created by Reagan in 1983 and expanded by Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and now Biden. Nicaragua in 1990 was its first victory. Through the use of money and pressure, the US took advantage of Nicaragua's lack of laws governing foreign money in its elections to create a unified 13-party anti-Sandinista coalition united behind the candidacy of Violeta Chamorro, widow of the martyred anti-Somoza newspaper publisher Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. The US then spent more per Nicaraguan voter than in 1988 George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis combined spent per US voter in our presidential election. At the same time, the US warned Nicaraguan voters that the Contra War, which had cost them 40,000 sons and daughters, would continue if Daniel Ortega were elected. You can bet your bottom dollar that the US quickly declared the 1990 election to be free and fair when Chamorro won. I've always thought it interesting, and it is seldom noted, that when Daniel Ortega placed the presidential sash over the shoulders of Violeta Chamorro, that was the first time in Nicaragua's history that governing power passed peacefully from one political party to another. The supposedly brutal autocrat Daniel Ortega achieved the first peaceful transition of power in his nation's history. Let's talk a minute about the National Endowment for Democracy and its primary funder, the U.S. Agency for International Development. USAID over the last 40 years has been converted from a brick and mortar foreign aid agency to the coordinator of foreign election manipulation, which the US calls democracy promotion. The NED is made up of 4 core groups: the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute are affiliated with the 2 political parties. Warmonger John McCain was chair of the IRI until his death in 2018, and Clinton Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is the longtime chair of the NDI. The AFL-CIO has its own affiliate, the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, also known as the Solidarity Center. And to round out the agents of empire, the Chamber of Commerce has its affiliate, the Center for International Private Enterprise. NED operates its own grants and also makes grants to its subgroups like the IRI and NDI, which they then administer or make yet other grants to local groups. It's a pretty sweet money laundering scheme, which they call democracy promotion, when it's actually just the opposite. When we at the Alliance for Global Justice first started tracking NED and its affiliates, it was easy to see what they were doing because it was right there on their web pages. But especially after we helped reveal their role in the quickly reversed 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, they began hiding the names of their grantees and disguising where the money was going by making it through regional grants. One way to follow the money is to track their job announcements. Wherever there's an election, Washington wants to influence NDI, IRI, NDI, and USAID job ads start appearing about a year earlier. When I led a pre-election delegation to Nicaragua in 2006 to investigate US interference in the election that returned the Sandinistas to office, we met with an International Republican Institute staff member. She told us, quote, "The relationship between the US and Nicaragua is like that of a parent and a child, and a son should not argue with his father." The National Democratic Institute and the IRI both ran a lot of trainings of youth and students in Nicaragua prior to the 2018 failed coup. There are still too many in the US progressive movement who believe the fake social media videos and the opposition was taught to, which the opposition was taught to produce during these democracy workshops. Nan's daughter has put together a lot of videoing the fake video, which is it's interesting to watch. The AFL-CIO Solidarity Center, another core group of the NDI, has been heavily involved in destabilizing Venezuela, but has not been involved much in Nicaragua. So in the interest of time, I'll skip over them and the Center for International Private Enterprise. USAID, NED, and the core groups also focus on funding opposition press, and Nicaragua media ownership is concentrated in the hands of the Chamorro family, and Nils may have more to say about that. Following the electoral defeat in 1990, Nicaragua suffered through 17 years of neoliberal deprivations, and which indebted the country to the international financial institutes, destroyed the rural economy, forcing workers into sweatshops, ended government subsidies for food, education, and healthcare. Grinding poverty and hopelessness replaced the pride and hope of the revolutionary years. Daniel Ortega probably won the 1996 presidential election. The US funded an electronic system to compile the votes from the various municipalities and voting tables, which gave highly questionable results. I was told personally by one observer that he overheard former Costa Rican President Oscar Arias say that Costa Ricans would never have accepted the results of the election. It was also said that Jimmy Carter told Ortega that he had to accept the results or be responsible for another Contra war. The election in 2001 was again held under conditions controlled by the US and the International Monetary Fund, and Daniel suffered his third defeat in a row. But it should be noted that throughout these dark years of neoliberalism, the FSLN remained the largest party in the National Assembly, where they were able to stop some of the worst deprivations of what Pope John Paul called savage capitalism. By the 2006 election, Nicaraguan voters had been suffering under neoliberalism for 17 years, with infant and maternal mortality skyrocketing, the rural peasant economy moribund, education too expensive for tens of thousands of families, prescriptions were free in the healthcare system, but they had no medicine, and electricity was available for scant hours a day. The voters had had enough, and Daniel Ortega squeaked into office with a bare plurality of 38%. That is the election I mentioned meeting with the IRI representative. Our delegation also met with US Ambassador Paul Treveli. Treveli had failed his assignment to unify the right behind one candidate, and he equally failed to learn who we were. He proudly told us that he had between 12 and $13 million to spend on the election. We had a press conference at the end of the delegation and revealed both the IRI's contempt for Nicaragua and the ambassador's admission of blatant interference. I like to think that we played a small role in the Sandinista victory that year. Daniel Ortega was reelected in 2011 and 2016, each time by greater majorities as the government policies have restored the economic and social rights of the people, reinvigorated the rural economy, restored labor rights to garment workers, restored free education and healthcare, and gave Nicaragua the fastest growing economy in the Americas prior to the US-backed failed coup in 2018. The US did not recognize either of those elections as legitimate. As in 2006, US ambassadors failed to unify the right around a single candidate and had to settle for destabilizing tactics and lies in the corporate media, as they have had to do with this year's election. Nils will talk about that. I know I'm over time, but I do want to say that US election manipulation in Nicaragua would be so much less effective if it were not for the craven so-called left in the US, which time after time act as useful fools to US imperialism by swallowing the US narrative hook, line, and sinker. We on the anti-imperialist left have to do a better job of educating our base and promoting a competing narrative of economic justice, respect for sovereignty, and peace. Follow us on AFGJ's website and the other ways that Barbara put up earlier. And with that, Barbara, back to you.
Thank you, Chuck. Wow. What a presentation. Oh my goodness. Our final speaker is Niels McCune. Niels has a master's in sustainable agriculture from the Universidad Central de las Villas in Cuba and a PhD in ecology and sustainable development from El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, EcoSur in Mexico. He has carried out research on agroecology, food systems education, and alternative economies in Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Puerto Rico. He is currently a research associate at the University of Vermont, a visiting researcher at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, EcoSur, in Mexico, and the regional communications specialist of La Via Campesina, North America. Please welcome Niels McCune.
Hi, everyone. It's really a treat to be here. I want to start off by just saying happy July 19th to all of you. It's just one day away, but the celebration has been happening for the last couple of days here in Nicaragua. Yesterday was Dia de la Alegría, the Day of Joy, which is commemorates the day that Somoza left the country. And on the drive to the school where I'm speaking to you from, which is the school of the Rural Workers Association in Nicaragua, the streets were filled with neighbors getting together. There's no centralized event this year due to COVID, but neighbors are taking care of each other, cooking food for each other. So it was like one big long barbecue all the way from Carazo to Managua today. So I want to share a quick presentation. Really what I'd like to do is invite everyone to try to learn more about Nicaragua, because what we can do in this short amount of time that we're going to be together today is very little. But I do want to share a few pieces of what could be part of, a deeper discussion that we can take the time to get into. I'll be also supporting this effort with a lot of work that Nan McCurdy has done in research, as well as other media, including William Grigsby and some of the work by the Gray Zone in the United States. So as we heard from Chuck, the 1990 elections were the most expensive elections in the history of the United States. So wait a minute, the Nicaraguan elections were the most expensive elections in the history of the United States. Yeah, that's right. That's how much covert money went into these elections. And we can see some of the actors there. And of course, the candidate of the Contra, the candidate of Reagan, was elected. And here is the celebration. Thank you again, Nan, for helping me find this photograph. It's really telling here. Second from the left is Carlos Fernando Chamorro, who many of you may remember from the 1980s as an editor of the Sandinista newspaper, Barricada, but who's also currently one of the main actors who is involved in this US funding of Nicaraguan media. He's the editor of Confidential. He also hosts Esta Noche and Esta Semana, and he's one of the most high-profile journalists. He is the son of Violeta Chamorro, so he's the son of the Reagan candidate who privatized Nicaragua. Over here on the right side of the screen, second from the right, is Cristina Chamorro. She is the sister of Carlos Fernando, the daughter of Violeta, and she's the most high-profile opposition figure in the last few weeks in Nicaragua, and we'll talk about her later on. And then next to her is her husband, Antonio Lacayo. Antonio Lacayo was in charge of privatizing state companies in the 1990 to 1996 term of Violeta, privatizing around 375 state companies, including the selling off of Nicaragua's railroads as scrapped metal. So here we can see folks that were apparently on opposite sides throughout the 1980s celebrating the victory of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro in March of 1990. So what's really important to try to understand Nicaragua today is to look at the 16-year period that started in 1990. There was a split in the FSLN, and many of us internationally heard more from and about the MRS over the next 16 years than we did about the FSLN. But within Nicaragua, there's a very strong difference between the two of them, although many of the top and best-known cadre, the English-speaking cadre, in fact, those coming from oligarchic families, were the ones who became well-known around the world. The Sandinista Front was the party that resisted the privatization efforts in every neighborhood across the fields, the countryside of Nicaragua, that fought to preserve the 6% of the national budget that would be dedicated to higher education, and became a grassroots force in every neighborhood. What people tell me is that Daniel Ortega became Daniel Ortega during the 1990s when he was an opposition figure that people associated with the defense of the achievements of the Sandinista revolution, even more than as president during the 1980s. Meanwhile, the MRS never made any organizing efforts in Nicaraguan neighborhoods and abandoned the flag of socialism, choosing to develop other alliances and becoming particularly dominant within the NGO sector of Nicaragua, focusing on things like human rights, access to healthcare, many interesting aspects, but from an NGO angle. That is, not necessarily thinking of these efforts in terms of what governments ought to be doing or what people's rights should be, but rather how to use international aid monies to carry out programs in Nicaragua. And that's a very fundamental difference that we'll talk about a little later. So what I want to bring to the attention of this group and ask you all to think about is the change in a strategy. This is a strategy of the United States, the State Department, the CIA, and the national security state. For decades, the emphasis of counter-revolutions was on right-wing counter-revolutions. We can think of the Contra War as a perfect example, but also we can think more recently of the failed Operation Gideon, which was an invasion by mercenaries contracted in Miami by Juan Guaido to invade Venezuela. We can consider the recent report, which sadly was not shared broadly in the United States media or around the world, that after the coup in Bolivia in 2019, of course, you all know there were elections in which Mas came back to power, and the outgoing government, the Minister of Defense, had telephone calls organizing a mercenary army from the United States to come in and take power before Mas could return to power in Bolivia. So that didn't Luckily, those plans didn't come into action, but there's very interesting evidence about that. You should read the article on The Intercept. But also another example is the assassination of Haiti's president just a week ago, which was carried out by 28 mercenaries who were contracted in Miami, 26 of them being Colombians. So this is the old school right-wing counter-revolution that we're used to. Jose Posada Capriles here, the terrorist form of counter-revolution. About 15 years ago, the CIA, the State Department, decided that this should be pushed back to a second plane of importance. What could be more important in the future would be leftist counter-revolution. So what is a counter-revolution from the left? Well, it has to do with what we've seen around the world of these color revolutions. The idea is to use a discourse that can be broadly appealing to young people, to people who are concerned about the environment, people who are concerned about gender rights, people who are concerned about many of the issues that really move young people, and how to channel those legitimate concerns by good intentioned people into regime change efforts against leftist governments. Over here, we see these different images of a clenched fist, which were used across Europe in these open society revolutions, right, which were promoted by the NGOs and foundations run by George Soros. That have moved to Latin America. In fact, Leopoldo Lopez was trained in some of these programs in Europe in the early 2000s. And here we see Mónica Balterano, who's a major figure in the MRS, the Movimiento de Renovación de Sandinismo, which is now called UNAMOS. And we'll talk about them a little bit later, but a leftist figure of Nicaragua who knows a lot about Sandinista history and who definitely knows the symbolism of wearing this shirt, which is all about taking down leftist governments in Europe and putting in their place neoliberal governments. So, and here in the bottom right, you can actually see Luis Almagro. He looks a little guilty as he's holding down there this Cuba Decide, which is, Cuba Decide is an NGO headquartered in Miami, which has close ties to the fascist right across Latin America, and which was present in all of the street manifestations last week in Cuba. Here's Luis Almagro sort of sheepishly participating in all of that along with other people. But it's this idea of how to organize a counter-revolution from the left, using some of the symbolism of the left, the tactics of the left, but having it all end up benefiting the privatizers. So how does this work? We're just gonna use the Nicaraguan example of 2018. First off, it's important to say that the old Contra and the new Contra have the same owners, the same objectives, but the tactics have changed. First off, they build a massive communications infrastructure that does not seem political. They work with key sectors that can be swayed and pushed, but also have legitimate interests in questions and grievances, such as journalists, artists, academics, NGO workers, but particularly youth. And then they find ways to mix legitimate criticism that occur in societies and within societies that have leftist governments with introduced messages, which come from their think tanks, in order to create a historical narrative where imperialism isn't the bad guy. So if we remember from 2018, all of the stuff that was appearing on Facebook, they said, oh yeah, the Sandinista revolution was great in the beginning, but Ortega betrayed it, and that's why we're here now. Completely forgetting the role of the United States in defeating the Sandinista revolution through a bloody Contra war. And then finally, there's a great deal of work in identifying, recruiting, training, and paying influencers within social media. The next step, and this again will refer to the events of 2018 in Nicaragua, some sort of street mobilization taking place in April 16th here in Nicaragua. There was a new law, April 16th, 2018, a new law that strengthened the social security system, but it did it by imposing a new tax on employers particularly, but also on workers. For workers, it was 0.25% increase, so it was almost unfelt. But for employers, it was a 2.5% increase, a much larger increase. And the Supreme Council of Private Enterprise in Nicaragua called for protests. And who protested were young, wealthy university students from UCA. Then what's called for with this sort of script of the new Contra is a street conflict of some kind. It has to be a fist fight, somebody screaming, sounds of gunshots. It doesn't have to base itself too much in reality, because the next step is tens of thousands of images, videos, urgent audio messages that are pumped into social media, mixing reality with fiction. They're usually based on real events, but with fake videos, fake photos, fake injuries, Photoshop, and in general, entirely falsifying the reality, and then multiplying that through bots and fake accounts, and then counting on the corporate television, radio, internet, and print media to repeat all of this thousands of times. The next phase, and this is important, all of this happens hour by hour. It cannot happen outside of the planned order, or it will not work. The next is that new mobilizations are based on entirely different issues, catching the government off guard. So, for example, the government in Nicaragua still thought the issue was Social Security reform, but by July 19th, the small groups of ransackers and protesters that were out on the street were protesting based on an entirely different narrative in social media, which was a narrative of repression by a dictatorial regime against peaceful protesters. In this setting of confusion, there's a sensory shock effort in Nicaragua was to paint the entire cities and to attack the symbols and monuments of Sandinista history, defacing memorials of famous Sandinista martyrs, etc. And then the entire passive media infrastructure activates. So in Nicaragua's case, that meant all of the WhatsApp groups were classified ads, or that were to help young people find the party on that particular weekend, all transformed into being 100% insurrection all the time, and trying to coordinate protest efforts, trying to get people out on the street, mobilize. And then come the false positives, the inflated death counts, the need for blood and death on the part of those who want to defeat the government. And that's when the international media comes into play. Personalities such as Residente de Calle 13, who called for more protests against the Nicaraguan regime, and just last week called for protests against Cuba. So then, and here in Nicaragua, this phase 3 was indeed necessary for the coup mongers, a campaign of hate crimes to intimidate government supporters. People were hiding their Sandinista flags because they could be lynched if they were found with any Sandinista colors, or with the carnet, which is the party member card. People were lynched for such things, with their teeth broken, arms broken, and in some cases they were stripped and killed. In some cases their bodies were mutilated. So there was extreme violence taking place, and the tactic of the tranques, or roadblocks, were to establish physical areas where only embedded reporting can take place. So only one version of what's taking place can reach the local corporate media, which, as we'll see, is all bought and paid for by the United States, and of course then reaching CNN and other media outlets. And then what happened here in Nicaragua is that anti-state actors in general joined in the melee. So the Catholic Church was deeply involved in the coup attempt here, paying for and putting church members on the roadblocks, but also agribusiness was deeply involved, Cargill was deeply involved, and narco traffickers were deeply involved. At that point, automatic rifles controlled the movement. I was stuck in the town that I was living in for 70 days without any possibility of leaving because of the 2 roadblocks on both ends of town, preventing the population from accessing basic needs. So Nicaragua, who did all this? Again, we're focusing on 2018 right now, and then we're going to talk about this year in just a second. There's a couple of key figures here, but the point is that there's 2 oppositions. There's one which is a clean-cut, generally white-skinned opposition, which presents itself before the cameras and is ready to be the transition government, right? Ready to take the lead, and of course has a pro-business model, a privatization plan, but is very well presented and well trained through the kinds of courses that Ned, National Republican Institute, International Republican Institute, and International Democratic Institute pay for. So these trainings teach people in the talk of democracy, right? They have an excellent civil discourse. And then on the other side, there's an extremely violent opposition. And the bridge between the two is always the key to understanding these things. And in Nicaragua, the bridge is Felix Maradiaga, who is incidentally an Aspen Institute fellow. And he's also, I'm going to forget the name of the foundation, but he's a fellow of a foundation in Chicago whose previous fellows include Leopoldo Lopez in Nicaragua and Yoani Lopez, the blogger, the anti-communist blogger in Cuba. So these key figures that form the bridge between the clean-cut opposition and the dirty tactics opposition are sort of the operators. And here, Felix Maradiaga was caught on camera with people with guns. He was also paying for arsons and hit jobs at the same time as he has presented himself as the executive director of a sort of obscure NGO that's main effort in Nicaraguan history has been to try to convince the Nicaraguan military to sell off all of its weapons. So 2018 was just another regime change operation, but as Chuck mentioned, it had support from this sort of pro-imperialist left, as Camilo Mejillo calls it, from around the world, including the United States. So US and Europe, quote, unquote, leftists were supporting the worst of the terror that the coup-mongers put on the Nicaraguan society. Of course, the media was an active participant, I would say the most active participant in the coup attempt, but also some of the lesser known NGOs, the Catholic Church, as we mentioned. Opus Dei played an important role. And I think we'll mention an Opus Dei figure in a couple minutes, agribusiness. So to try to move us to the present, because time is short, 2019, there's a lot to say about 2019, and you can find it in a book that's called The Revolution Will Not Be Stopped. I highly recommend this book. But one of the key things about 2019 is that it was a year of reconciliation. The Nicaraguan government surprised many by creating an amnesty law, which allowed each and every person who had been put into jail or arrested based on the events of 2018, that's the actual terms of the law, to be freed on the condition that they commit to a non-repetition of events. So this amnesty, it makes sense in Nicaraguan history. It's hard for people to understand outside of Nicaragua because people who had committed heinous crimes, including murder and torture, were set free, but again, on the condition that they not participate again. And I think what's important to mention here is that US intervention unfortunately works. And the way that it works is by dividing people, by dividing and conquering. It worked in the 1980s so that a mercenary war actually became a civil war. And that's something that Nicaraguans told me when I arrived to Nicaragua many, many times, that the Contra War actually became a civil war of sorts because there was a large part of the population that was scared of communism and was getting all sorts of propaganda on the radio and was interested in the big, nice boots and big guns and good meals that the Contra fighters were eating and so participated. And the same thing happened in 2018. The salaries that people were making to man the roadblocks were very high, and a lot of people got involved. Young people got involved from poor neighborhoods who were really the ones putting themselves on the line. Obviously, those who directly take the funds of the United States government are not the ones who are going to risk their own lives to participate. They're living too well. But those who live in conditions of vulnerability are likely to be moved. So 2019 was about reconciling and building this amnesty. But at the same time, there was this position of no repetition, right? No repetition of what just took place. So the first law, which is actually at the very bottom there, was in 2018. This was a law against money laundering for violent means, right? This is to prevent money that comes into the country for development purposes, et cetera, to be used to pay people to carry out violence. Very specific law, as you can see. By 2020, there's 3 laws that I want to discuss here. One is 1040, this is the law to regulate foreign agents. There's a similar law in pretty much every country of Europe. The United States has one that was made in the 1930s. And basically, you have to register. If you work for a foreign government and you're working for the interests of those foreign governments, you have to register in Nicaragua. And we'll talk about that again in just a second. 1042 is the law against cyber crimes. So using digital media to hurt people or to publish someone's address so that others will hurt them, etc., is against the law. Again, the European Union has a very similar law. Law 1055 is called the Law to Defend the People's Right to Sovereignty, Independence, and Self-Determination. So those who work for a foreign power to promote an invasion, coup, or economic sanctions against Nicaragua are guilty of treason. This had actually been created, a similar law was created in the 1990s under Violeta Chamorro, but this law is a little bit more specific and touches on the issue of sanctions, including them as a sort of violent action against Nicaragua. But at the same time, of course, the United States government was busy. So by the end of 2018, there was the NICA Act, which prevents Nicaragua from having access to loans. Now, of course, as Nan mentioned, the amount of damage, destruction, trauma, and carnage, right? The actual physical destruction and the psychological impact of 2018 was much more than the hurricanes, much more than the COVID pandemic. And rebuilding Nicaragua required access to funds. And so the United States government prevented those funds from coming and demanded that Nicaragua would have to carry out early and US approved elections in order to have access to any funds in order to rebuild. The Renacer Act of 2021, and here I'm skipping many different kinds of sanctions that have been created in the meantime, mostly to target individuals within Nicaragua, the police force, banks, all of these things that have made it extremely hard for any project to take place in Nicaragua, extremely hard for NGOs to have any activities, extremely hard for the government to spend any money. The Renacer Act, which is on the verge of being passed, advances the strategic alignment of the United States diplomatic tools towards the realization of free, fair, and transparent elections, again, to be determined by the United States. But to make this short, these are just more tools in the toolbox of making Nicaraguans suffer as long as they continue to vote for the Sandinista front. And then finally, I'll mention that this leaked document, Responsive Assistance in Nicaragua. It's a contract that is promoted by USAID, so it's a private corporation which would take on this contract. Transition appears in the document 102 times. It's a 14-page document. I encourage you all to find it and read it. Very interesting. It proposes 3 scenarios for Nicaragua. The one is an election the United States approves, right? And the Sandinistas are, of course, voted out, and government supporting free enterprise is voted in. So that is called, what do they call it? It's they call it a nice transition, so an orderly transition. The second scenario is a sudden, unanticipated transition. So this is really the coup strategy, right? This is some sort of a snap or failed election. And this is what the primary focus was for now, because the third option is continued FSLN governance. So as we can see, the United States is zeroing in on another coup attempt in Nicaragua. And how are they doing that? So since 2007, the Violeta Barrios de Chamorro Foundation, or the Chamorro Foundation, has been the recipient of hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States and also from Europe to give to Nicaraguan media organizations, NGOs, and other opposition actors to carry out this combination of everything that's considered to be legal, along with illegal and armed sorts of opposition, right? And here we can see the television presence, the radio presence, and the digital platforms, but there's many, 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 many more beyond this. Again, really focused on the youth and to the tune of 6 to 12 million USD per year. Now, to have an idea of how this money is felt in Nicaragua, let's just take a look at the difference here in the GDP per capita in the United States is 65,000, whereas in Nicaragua it's under 2,000. So when we talk about hundreds of millions of dollars, that's a lot of money that employs a lot of people in Nicaragua, and that can make a big difference. So here we go with the hot topic of the day, right? We've all been seeing this in headlines around the world that some famous people have been thrown in jail or under house arrest in Nicaragua. And I just want to touch on what these people are accused of doing. I think it's a total of 26 people. About 20 of them come from the wealthiest families in Nicaragua, which is, of course, why this is news, because Honduras, which has 5,000 farmers in prison for trying to farm, is not news, right? But Nicaragua, that has 20 people with famous last names, of course, is news. Now, what are these people accused of doing, and what will the process be? First off, we have people who are accused of failure to register as a foreign agent. Now, the main case that we've heard about is Cristina Chamorro. She is the executive director of the Chamorro Foundation. She is the one who's been sitting on these hundreds of millions of dollars that have come in and has been passing them to different coup actors, different regime change actors. So because of the law of 2020, she had to register as a foreign agent in the beginning of February. And of course, she didn't want to do that because that would have destroyed her reputation even in the splintered opposition of Nicaragua. And so to avoid registering as a foreign agent, she closed the foundation. And when she closed the foundation, $7 million that were in the foundation's accounts showed up in 3 different bank accounts of her own. So by hiding funds in personal bank accounts, she violated the money laundering law, at least according to the prosecutors in Nicaragua. And so she will face charges for that. And she's under house arrest right now. There are also those who have been participating in post-election coup planning. Those include Dora Maria Chamorro, who we see in the picture here, and who I've just heard from Ben Norton that he will have a very extensive political biography of coming out soon. So I won't tell too much about her. I don't want to give any good stuff away, but you'll soon find out just how much of a Sandinista she really is. And then here we also have Humberto Belli, right, brother of Gioconda Belli, who was the education minister under Violeta Chamorro. So he was the guy in charge of privatizing the schools of Nicaragua, probably one of the most hated figures in the entire country for privatizing schools. People remember when they had to bring their own chairs to school, when children who were too hungry to play would sleep through recess. There was all sorts of awful realities that Nicaraguan children went through based on the privatization of public education. And there he is. He's being accused of tax fraud, among other things, because of the management of Funides, which is a foundation, just another U.S. money recipient, right? And then this graphic here, of course, shows when we talk about coup scenarios, we're not joking, right? This has happened almost everywhere in Latin America. And you might see a big gray empty spot in the center there. That is Bolivia, right? In the center of South America, which of course had its own coup in 2019. So much for that gray spot. It's all red. It's all been flipped through coups by the United States. And then finally, just to touch on Chamorro family one last time, they've had 6 presidents in the past. They'd like to have a 7th, but who is it going to be? We have these 3 who don't actually work together. They're fighting between them. The top and the bottom there are Carlos Fernando and Cristina, who are brother and sister, and then Juan Sebastian, who's their cousin. There's sort of the successful side of the Chamorro family and the loser side of the Chamorro family. But there they are looking to take back Nicaragua once again for the oligarchs. And of course, the Chamorro family has always been the agent of US imperialism in Nicaragua. They've been the bridge between the oligarchy and US interests. So this has been a very quick explanation of the many shapes and forms of US intervention since 2007, from the machine gunning of people who went to the July 19th parade in 2017 to 2016, to the large-scale coup attempt in 2018. There's been lots of violence to it, and it's always had the same owners, the same operators, just different methods. But Nicaraguans continue to develop their everyday heroism. These are some images from the October hurricane in Nicaragua, Iota. This was the second of 2 hurricanes. And these are the police, special forces, police officers rescuing a little baby, carrying her across a river. And this is the heroism that people inside Nicaragua know about. This is why the police are the most popular police in Latin America. Of course, the complete opposite of what we hear about or might think for those of us who are outside of Nicaragua. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer period.
Niels, that was amazing. That was excellent. You went way over, and I didn't have the heart to stop you because every word you spoke was so fascinating and informative. I don't know whether we're able to stay on a little longer today. Let's start at least quickly with some of the most central questions people have asked. Here's one from Kathy Hoyt that I think is pretty good. It seems to me that the divisions between us and the left that has bought into this narrative is a difference about what rights are important. The US-supported left is only interested in civil and political rights, while for the other part of the left, which is us, I guess, the most important rights are the social and economic rights, especially the rights of the poor. Please comment. Who would like to? Chuck would like that. Go ahead.
Please.
Well, of course, that's true. Kathy's made this observation many times. The portion of the left that swallows the imperialist line is the left, the neoliberal left, the ones who follow the individual rights of man and economic rights of man rather than the group rights of socialism. I mean, I don't consider them part of the same movement that I'm part of. But that is, Kathy hits the nail on the head. If you have elections and 2 parties that believe the same thing pass leadership back and forth to each other, then they're satisfied that there's a democracy. If you have a revolution and children can eat and wear shoes, that doesn't count.
I'd like to add to that. Ordinarily, I don't end up answering questions as a moderator, but I wrote something a day or 2 back that I think adds to this. What is democracy anyhow? I think at its heart, it is the very end, quoting this person, empowerment and capacity for self-determination of the popular majority. And while voting can be a means to that end, and speaking your mind can be a means to that end, that isn't enough in and of itself. Surely wealth and ownership distribution are very important means to self-determination of the majority. Okay. All right, so what does the U.S. gain by controlling Nicaragua? It's simply the continuous supply of money and income for the neoliberal sector, or is there something we're missing? Niels.
Okay, I'd like to jump in on that one. The United States has wanted to control Nicaragua since long before Panama existed, since the 1850s with William Walker. So the obsession with Nicaragua has different dimensions than just resources, right? Nicaragua does not have oil. What it is the threat of a good example for sure, because Nicaragua, for example, before the 2018 coup attempt was the only country in Central America that did not buy food from the United States, and of course hasn't purchased weapons from the United States, and in fact was the only country in the region with a positive trade balance with the US. So all of those things irk the United States, but it's much more than that. It's the fact that the Sandinista government of Nicaragua has shown consistent solidarity with the Palestinian cause, was the only country in the world outside of Afghanistan and a couple other countries that were wrapped up in war to vote against the Paris Climate Agreement for being too weak, for not protecting Mother Earth. So Sandinista Nicaragua represents a threat of a different way of thinking, and a way of thinking that can be very successful, because in terms of governance, there's no country really in Latin America that has shown the same results over the last 13 years. That, I believe, is the main issue, but also there's an obsession with Nicaragua that goes beyond that I don't know how to describe or explain.
Someone asks whether these and previous presentations could be, or especially these 3 talks, could be transcribed and published. Well, Nan's, I believe, will be already, probably going into Nika Notes. And the other 2, I hope so. Does that sound good to the 2 speakers?
Sure.
Great. Okay. There a couple of questions have come in about 2 particular so-called leftists who are no longer leftists. Dora Maria Tejas, and then Daniel Ellsberg's grandson, Martinez, I forget his first name. Can you explain how did they come to the stance that they're at, or can you explain any of that? Okay, Niels.
I had hoped to avoid that one. I don't know. I just know that they have, and that there's been, first it's like a sort of a tolerance for the U.S. Embassy as they continue to struggle, for a better Nicaragua. And then there starts to be more and more and more collaboration. And I think that what unites these folks, first off, there's an employer-employee relationship with the U.S. government often. In the case of some of the left in the United States that supported the coup attempt in Nicaragua, I think there's a bit of a disillusionment with leftist efforts and with the idea of using the state to better the lives of people. But of course, for Nicaraguans, they don't have the option of such a sophisticated analysis. They're looking at their neighbors and what their neighbors are living through, which is living hell, and what their past has been, which is the nightmare of privatization that lasted 16 years. So without that cushion and privilege to ignore those factors, they fight the way that they know how to fight, and they win the way that they know how to win. And that's really aggravating for the United States. And the US has endless budget to find people who can, for one reason or another, take those positions. In fact, there's some cases where people, for very personal reasons, have decided to focus their life energy on living off of US government money to oppose Daniel Ortega.
Two people have asked questions related to how do we convince some of the mainstream media, such as the New York Times or Al Jazeera, how do we combat it, or how do we try to fight against that kind of effort, the imperialist narratives? Chuck.
Well, we can't convince them. I mean, they're the tools of imperialism. That's what they're there for. We have to constantly struggle to get out a counter narrative so that people can make can employ critical thinking and know how to read the newspaper, et cetera. So we have to keep writing letters to the editor and doing sign-on letters and calling Congress about legislation for sanctions, et cetera. But I would be happy if we could just convince the left. not to be imperialist. I actually had stuck my hand up on that previous question. If I could just add to that, after the party split in 1994, the MRS was formed, and we had the illusion at the time that the MRS was going to be opposing the FSLN from the left. I was leading regular delegations to Nicaragua during the mid-90s, and we would always meet with the MRS, and I would always ask, what are you doing to educate the base about, and to build an electoral movement? And they never had an answer that they were doing anything other than allying with right-wing parties. So I've understood since the mid-90s that the MRS did not offer a path for supporters of socialism.
Okay. The other questions that were asked are not directly related to this webinar. I'm thinking that perhaps we could offer them to the speakers later on to be answered via email, if that's okay. And we'll thank everybody for participating in this. Excellent questions and very excellent speakers. Thank you so much. Thanks to all. Good night.
Thank you.